The Psychology of Power, Lessons from Machiavelli. There is a sentence that wanders like a dagger through every century. It is safer to be feared than loved. Most people think it was written by a villain. It was written by a man who wanted his city to survive. Picture a dim room outside Florence, winter settling over the fields, a fire struggling to keep its promise of light. A man in exile returns from a day spent haggling with neighbors, mud on his boots, ink on his fingers, and sorrow in the quiet of his house. He hangs his rough country clothes, washes, and changes, he says this himself, into courtly robes, the garments of a vanished life. And then he sits down at a shabby table and opens the door to the dead. I join myself to them, he writes to a friend, and there I taste the food that alone is mine and for which I was born. The dead are Livy, Tacitus, Plutarch, the keepers of human nature. The man is named Niccolò Machiavelli, and whether you fear him or misunderstand him, you live in a world that knows his voice, even when it pretends to loathe it. What would you do if your goodness made you pray? That is Machiavelli's opening insult to our self-image. Not because he despised goodness, but because he watched it lose. He watched Florence fall to the sermon of a prophet, and then to the knives of a family. He watched republics talk themselves to death, while men with fewer words and steadier hands walked in uninvited. He watched ideals laid like wreaths on tombs. And he asked the question decent people try to laugh away. If you refuse to understand power, do you deserve to hold it? Power is a shapeshifter. It wears robes and uniforms, bank accounts and hashtags. It's not just in palaces and parliaments. It's in offices where someone keeps interrupting you and you let them. It's in families where one person's mood becomes the weather of the day. Power is the permission to decide what happens next. The psychology of power, why we seek it, how we keep it, what it does to the mind that carries it, has not changed as much as we like to claim. Machiavelli is sometimes called the teacher of evil. He is something colder and more useful, the cartographer of necessity. He stands in the doorway between two eras. On one side, the soft chant of virtue. Be good, and the world will follow. On the other, the harsh laughter of reality. The world follows whoever arranges it. Machiavelli offers not a blessing, but a set of instruments, and the first one is a mirror. Look, he says, at the face you present. Men judge more by the eye than by the hand. They see, they do not touch. Your intentions are irrelevant to strangers. You will be measured by what you can make visible. Strength, stability, the performance of care. And somewhere behind that mask sits the self you think is real, wondering if this is betrayal or merely adulthood. Imagine power as a room filled with fog. Those who feel lost make big gestures. Those who know the corners move quietly. Mastery, in Machiavelli's words, requires two animals in you, the lion and the fox. The lion is force, the fox is cunning. Courage without cleverness is theater. Cleverness without courage is a rumor. The people you follow, the people who direct your days, are combinations of animal and actor. Machiavelli doesn't ask you to admire them. He asks you to notice why they win. If you want to govern human beings, you need to understand their fears like a locksmith understands a key. People do not sit in the sunshine of detached rationality. They are tugged by patterns, biases, illusions. Threats feel heavier than promises. Harm remembered is sharper than good done. We forgive slowly and punish quickly. A leader who misreads this loses not only power, but followers who feel betrayed by their own expectations, which is the bitterest kind of betrayal. You can hear in Machiavelli's sentences the rustle of a curtain lifting on the theater of the mind, crowns made of attention, thrones built from the wish to be safe. And yet there is a current in his thought that disturbingly resembles love. Not love of the leader for the people, but love of the city for its own survival. He was a servant of the Florentine Republic. He negotiated, schemed, pleaded, advised, and finally paid for his loyalty with humiliation. When the Medici returned to power, he was dismissed, accused, imprisoned, tortured. His arms were twisted behind his back, his body hoisted again and again until pain made him ancient inside. He was released, banished to his family's little property, and there in the quiet he wrote The Prince, not as a villain's confession, but as a job application and a warning. This is the paradox at the heart of the psychology of power. The more honestly you see it, the harder it is to want it, and the more necessary it is that someone who sees it holds it. He calls the force we cannot control Fortuna, fortune, the river that floods and drowns. He calls our capacity to push back virtue, not virtue, as moral purity, but vigor, skill, the ability to shape the day. You will not make fortune harmless, he says, but you can build embankments, prepare channels, learn where the water seeks to go. And perhaps the most troubling of his phrases is also the one that feels most true. There is cruelty well used, and cruelty badly used. He does not mean cruelty feels good. He means harm concentrated, explained, and ended can sometimes spare a society the slow torture of endless fear. He means a leader will sometimes have to be the surgeon of a wound that everyone denies. What matters is not your opinion of him. What matters is whether you recognize yourself in the world he described. He wrote for princes and republics. He wrote for founder and functionary. He accidentally wrote for you, navigating your office politics, your friend group, your private empire of obligations and delicate truths, trying to decide what to conceal and what to show. Because power does not begin in palaces. It begins wherever two people compete without agreeing they have done so. If you want a reason to keep listening, here is one. Machiavelli's book is less a manual for tyrants than a defense against them. It teaches you the traps they set and the masks they wear, the performances that seduce and the fears that can be made to bloom. It teaches you to recognize the river when it's still a trickle, to build your embankments before the flood. It is not a moral nap, it is a weather report. And outside your window, the sky is already changing. So let's step into rooms where rumors become laws, where friendships are currency, where beliefs are costumes and habits become fate. Let's examine the stagecraft of power and the parts that psychology has assigned to us without our consent. Machiavelli does not promise comfort. He promises clarity, which is often what we call discomfort when it refuses to go away. Begin with a man on a horse. The horse is black and sweating. A man's face is handsome in a way that makes trust feel like an error. Cesare Borgia, the son of a pope at an age when popes fathered children and armies. Machiavelli meets him while on diplomatic missions, and for a few pages in The Prince, you can feel admiration pulse under the ink like blood. Borgia is the case study that becomes a legend, a leader who seems to have discovered the grammar of fear. The Romagna region was chaos when Borgia arrived. Feuding lords treating peasants like kindling, taxes levied like punishments, law a rumor. Borgia's first move was not tenderness. He sent a man named Ramiro de Orco, a hard and brutal administrator, to pacify the region. Ramiro did what he was told with a cruelty that makes the stomach retreat. A few swift, horrifying punishments, public enough to stain memory. Order returned. People slept more. Shops opened. Markets resumed their murmuring. And then this is the moment Machiavelli wants you to watch closely. Borgia staged a public miracle. He had Ramiro executed in the town square, cut in half with a bloody knife set beside him. The message was wordless and perfect. The pain you suffered to achieve security was not my inclination, but my necessity. The evil has been punished. I, your prince, am just. The crowd saw the halves of a man and felt almost whole. If you want to understand power, understand that fear is more precise than love. Fear has a sharp silhouette and a narrow vocabulary. It points, it halts, it compresses. Love is a field with no fences. You can make people fear with a spectacle. You keep them loving with 100 quiet decisions. In psychology, we know the vivid wins over the statistical. One brutal image outweighs months of boring safety. We call it the availability heuristic. Borgia knew it before we named it. Give them an image to remember and an explanation to repeat. He understood another bias too: contrast. After horror, mere discomfort feels like mercy. Machiavelli's lesson here is not admiration for a sadist. It's instruction in staging. Leaders who understand attention can convert their worst necessities into proofs of their best intentions. It's a cynical alchemy, but you live in it daily. Companies perform contrition after scandals not only to apologize, but to control the narrative of accountability. A parent who imposes a sudden strict rule and removes it after consideration is not merely flexible. They are teaching that pain comes and goes with their judgment. Power choreographs light and shadow so that gratitude appears between them. But Borgia's story also contains a trap. He built smart embankments against fortune. He neutralized enemies, courted the people, placed loyal men in key cities. He even tricked some of his rivals into a meeting and had them strangle it at dinner, which is the kind of cruelty badly used that history remembers in detail and survivors remember forever. Then fortune changed the Pope. His father died. Borgia fell sick. Suddenly all his plans relied on bodies he could not control. The rivets snapped. Machiavelli, who had almost fallen in love with his competence, watched the river claim him. This is the second law of power psychology. Control creates the illusion of sufficiency. You start to believe that your skill seals the world. Confirmation bias whispers that your successes came from design, your failures from others. You edit your memory to honor your strategy. And then something breaks that you did not even know was load-bearing. Any leader who thinks the door will open because they want it to will eventually leave fingerprints on wood that doesn't budge. Florence offers another scene. Before the Medici returned, the city had listened to a different music. A monk Savonarola preaching on bonfires of vanities. He gathered the city's guilt into piles of art and luxury, and he burned them. Cosmetics, paintings, instruments, dresses offerings to a god who was always one octave louder than joy. For a moment, the city believed in him, or believed in its need to tremble. Machiavelli watched this too. He wrote later, "All armed prophets have conquered, the unarmed have been destroyed." It sounds cruel, and it is, but it's also a description. People may follow a vision, but they stay when they feel protected. If your authority rests only on their excitement, it will last no longer than a festival. If it rests on their fear, it can last through boredom. If it rests on institutions, it can outlast you. This brings us to a quieter arrangement of power, the appearance of virtue. Machiavelli wants you to consider how much you rely on the story of someone's goodness to make your life easier. He says a prince should appear merciful, faithful, humane, religious, upright. And the uncomfortable phrase is appear. Because the masses, he writes without apology, judge by what they see and what appears to be. Let that sentence haunt you next time a leader posts a photo with a dog, a child, a tear they claim is for you. This is not to indict every gesture. It is to remind you that symbols are tools, and tools get sharpened. Psychology nods here eagerly. Social proof tells us we rely on signals, uniforms, titles, confident tones when time is short or risk feels present. Authority bias tells us we obey those who look like the role. Milgram's obedience studies are difficult to watch, even in description. Ordinary people pressing switches they thought delivered shocks, because a man in a lab coat said the script demanded it. None of them were monsters. They were, tragically, participants in their own comfort. It was easier to obey the structure than to absorb the horror. Power uses our wish not to be alone with doubt. A crowd does not only electrify, it erases. Machiavelli also turns to conspiracies, and his advice is ice. Do not make a habit of them. Why? Because conspiracies require many silent tongues and no mistakes, a psychological condition rare enough to be mythical. He who conspires, he says, may fear it every time. Paranoia is the tax. He recommends a better route. Build favor among the people. The great men around you, the elites, will always desire to oppress. The people desire only not to be oppressed. If you must build your safety, build it on the wider desire. Popular support, in his view, is a psychological technology. 1,000 small loyalties instead of a few powerful ones. Many light strings can hold what one heavy chain cannot. Notice the other edge. When you rely on the people, you must feed their perception regularly. You must be seen. You must be predictable enough to comfort and unpredictable enough to be respected. The people are less fickle than their reputation suggests, Machiavelli insists, but they notice when you stop noticing them. This is the social contract, not as moral poem, but as daily maintenance. If you think this is far from you, think of a boss who stops saying good morning, of a friend who stops asking any question that isn't convenient. Power's maintenance is largely small talk with the reality of others. And then there is Machiavelli, a human being, taken from his office, accused of conspiring against a family that had clawed back its throne. He had spent his career trying to hold the city together without the old sacred stories. He had believed in competence and cunning, and the center that does not announce itself. For that, he was dragged into the ugliness that waits for servants of fragile orders. They tortured him, he confessed. He took it back later, who wouldn't, when pain is the editor of speech. He was released to the countryside, where no one greeted him as he deserved. This is part of the psychology of power they don't teach in glossy leadership seminars. When you have no role, people stop knowing who you are. So Machiavelli writes The Prince. The legend says he wrote it to please the Medici, to get a job. Maybe it's true. Maybe it's partly true. He also writes because he has watched leaders make the same mistake. They think they are owed more choices than they have. He writes to show them the narrowness of their roads. He writes to show us how someone like Borgia could be brilliant and doomed, how someone like Savonarola could be loved and burned, and how a city that wants to survive must stop asking the river not to be water. And somewhere in the ink, a question begins to soften the wall between you and these people with banners and titles. When you arrange your life so that others depend on you, how do you make fear and love useful instead of fatal? What do you do when the only choices lead to someone's disappointment? How do you stage your reasons without lying to yourself about them? Every parent with a curfew, every manager with a deadline, every friend who knows a secret and must decide whether to speak, lives in the mundane suburb of Machiavelli's city. The grand words shrink to the size of the day. The psychology of power is not lofty. It is as intimate as a sigh. You could close the prince and walk away thinking you've met a guide for tyrants. If you stopped there, you'd miss the other voice in Machiavelli's house. In the daylight, he wrote about princes. At night, he wrote about republics. The Discourses on Livy is his love letter to liberty that refuses to pretend liberty is gentle. If the prince is a knife, the Discourses is a loom. Threads crossing, knots tied, patterns emerging from arguments that refuse to stand still. He begins with a scandalous suggestion for the well-mannered. The tumults between the nobles and the people in ancient Rome did not harm the Republic. They preserved it. Conflict, if regulated, is oxygen. He does not romanticize civic hatred. He notices what it does psychologically. It forces institutions to develop. Out of the noise came the tribunes, legal channels for rage. Out of the suspicion came accountability. There is a deep insult here to modern sensibilities that treat harmony as the only measure of health. Machiavelli proposes a more difficult measure. A state is healthy when it can metabolize dissent without murdering it. The psychology of power shifts here from the ruler's mind to the civilian heart. The people do not always know what they want, but they recognize what they do not want: to be despised, excluded, mocked. That recognition is a compass. He praises the Roman method of giving the people outlets, assemblies, offices, rituals that empower them to refuse humiliation. He even praises scapegoats as political safety valves, which is arguably one of his ugliest sentences and one of his clearest. Give anger a place to sit, and it may not set fire to the drapes. We are not beyond this. Think of public inquiries after disasters, the ritual of blame and forgiveness. Think of hearings where outrage is televised and briefly fed. You can argue this is manipulation. Machiavelli would say, it is anatomy. In the Discourses, he also talks about corruption, and not the simple kind of envelopes under tables. He means the rot of customs. When people no longer love the laws or believe the leaders intend to obey them, when offices are bought as easily as furniture, when success is measured by clever theft and praised as knowing how the world works, that is corruption. Psychology knows this terrain too. Norms erode quietly. If you see others cheat and keep the rewards, your moral muscles atrophy. The Stanford prison experiment, flawed though it was, reminded us how fast roles supply the permission ordinary people need to behave unlike themselves. We are built to adapt. That is our gift and our danger. How to resist? Machiavelli is not sentimental. He recommends founders. He recommends return to beginnings. He recommends what a therapist might call disconfirming experiences for a society. Make people feel the law again. Replace a few rotten elites with unexpected citizens. Hold trials, you mean. Reward men who can be embarrassed by praise they did not earn. At the center of all this is his insistence that laws are only as real as the people who expect them to be obeyed. Vert, in a republic, is not the prince's agility. It is the citizen's capacity to refuse to be trifled with. He loves founders who commit crimes for the sake of foundations, and he knows this statement will make you flinch. Romulus kills his brother. Moses brings not only tablets, but swords. Numa Pompilius, the second king of Rome, invents religious ceremonies not only to honor gods, but to discipline humans. To Machiavelli, this is not blasphemy. It's anthropology. Rituals are a kind of psychology built out of time. They teach predictability, and predictability is one of the ways humans feel safe enough not to seek a strong man daily. We are so rational that we need candles. He also says the most dangerous time is the transition. When changing a constitution or a country's habits, you have enemies who did well under the old and tepid supporters who do not yet believe they will do well under the new. Reformers often expect gratitude. They receive instead attacks from one side and shrugs from the other. The psychology here is pure loss aversion. The pain of losing is felt more deeply than the pleasure of gaining. Leaders of any scale should write this sentence on their palm before they try to fix anything. Your good will hurt before it heals, and people feel first what stings. All of this complicates the simple caricature of Machiavelli as a dark priest of manipulation. He is as much a civic engineer as he is a strategist for princes. His virtue is no choirboys. His language sometimes injures the modern ear. He describes fortune as a woman to be mastered, a metaphor that exposes his era's coarseness as surely as it exposes his fatalism. We need not admire this to learn what sits behind it. A faith that luck prefers the prepared, the audacious, those who move while others argue about whether movement is polite. Psychologists call it the internal locus of control, the belief that your actions influence outcomes. Carried too far, it becomes the illusion of control. Balanced, it becomes readiness. Readiness is the forgotten cousin of morality. It says do not wait for a motivation that flatters you. Do what the situation demands. If that sounds dangerous, it is. Dirty hands, later philosophers would call it. The idea that a good leader may have to commit a wrong for the sake of a larger right. The danger is not the willingness to stain oneself. It is the willingness to wash too easily. Machiavelli's cruelty, well used, depends on a human capacity that is rarer than power, the appetite to stop when you can go on. The world is full of men who mistake momentum for necessity. He begs us to know the difference. And then this is where you realize he is not caressing tyranny. Machiavelli praises citizen militias over mercenaries. He despises private armies hired to do public work. He says soldiers who fight for pay go where pay is better. Soldiers who fight for laws go where their life already is. This is not just strategy. It is a theory of mind. Loyalty that comes from involvement, from identity, is stronger than loyalty that comes from transaction. Every leader learns this late or early. You can buy hands, you must earn hearts, and you cannot rent souls. In your life, the discourses may seem far from your desk. They are not. Institutions are the habits of groups. Your team's norms are their constitution. When new rules come, expect resistance from the comfortable, and be patient with the unpersuaded. Create rituals. Praise publicly. Punish rarely, but decisively. Allow disagreements to happen where they can be managed. Don't aim for quiet. Aim for safety. Repeat yourself. Make your promises audible and your mistakes visible. Do not outsource the hard parts of your work to people who do not believe in it. That is what Machiavelli would tell a leader who asks, in a whisper, to be good and effective and still sleep. What of fortune? He calls her the flood that follows a season of confidence. You can hear the river even now, in the tremor you feel when something you counted on feels loose. We do not control our era, our biology, our luck. We control our posture. There is an ethics in that posture. Stand as if you expect to be asked to do the thing that frightens you, but saves others. Build as if you want the next person to inherit something easier than you had. Laugh when your most cunning plan is revealed as brittle by a child's question. Change course when the facts move. Accept the dirt on your hands, only if you can name it, explain it, and promise not to make a career out of it. Behind all this, a man in a poorly heated house writes by candlelight, not to flatter cruelty, but to say, here is how human beings are. Work with what they are, or pretend to love what they are not, and then collapse when they do not perform your virtue on command. Power is a cold room. Everyone says you are brilliant or dangerous, and somehow both sentences erase your actual face. No one knows how tired your lungs are. They do not hear the small sound when you wake at 3 a.m. to listen for a disaster that hasn't happened yet, but keeps sending you invitations anyway. They see your headlines. They do not see your trembling. Machiavelli knew something about that trembling. The man who writes about the necessity of tough choices also writes about the loneliness of them. He writes about leaders who cannot admit uncertainty without losing the right to decide. Wear the mask long enough, and you will forget the contours underneath. We have experiments now that put numbers on this old ache. Psychologists talk about the power paradox, the traits that help you gain power empathy, collaboration, attentiveness, fade when power arrives. Neural pathways alter with status. Dr. Keltner calls it disinhibition. The leader starts to take more, interrupt more, empathize less. It is not a moral sentence. It is a human tendency sharpened by the sensation of being above consequences. Imagine the prince who has no one around him who will laugh at his joke because it isn't funny. Imagine the CEO who hasn't been contradicted in 3 meetings, 3 months, 3 years. Imagine the head of a family no one wants to disappoint, whose children have learned the art of soft self-erasure to avoid the throb of his frown. Power needs friction, or it drifts. Machiavelli advises princes to choose capable counselors and to allow them to tell the truth. He warns them not to flatter themselves and not to tolerate flatterers. He wrote this 500 years before motivational podcasts, and it remains more radical. And then there is time, the enemy that pretends not to be. Leaders are mortal. Their reforms decay. Their statues gather pigeons. This is the cosmic angle of the psychology of power. You need to rule today with the humility of someone who will not be here tomorrow. That is not resignation. That is the mood that leaves space for successors. One of Machiavelli's most tender sentences is not about victory. It is about legacy. In republics, he says, it is the institutions that sustain liberty, not the constancy of any one man. If this sounds like common sense, look around. How many systems have been built on the hope that one person will always be honest, always be strong, always remember the faces of people whose names he does not need for his work? Power without institutions is a tree with shallow roots. It looks green until the wind stops being polite. The pathos of modern strongmen is how fragile they are. Their health becomes national security. Their moods determine exchange rates. Their sleep schedule fills the silences of millions. Machiavelli would have sighed. You built a palace on a single pillar and called it destiny. He also had a sense of the tenderness behind ambition. The hunger to be seen, to be useful, to matter more than the bones of a day. These are human wishes. They make artists, leaders, and liars. If you care about the world, you find yourself at the edge of that wish sometimes, worried that without some kind of authority, you will be relegated to commentary, while braver people act. Machiavelli is not telling you to choke your compassion. He is inviting you to dress it in armor and lead it through a world where pity alone is prey. Better to feel the weight on your shoulders than to pretend the weight isn't there and then complain about gravity. But there are shadows that cling to all this. Cruelty, well used, has been cited to excuse horrors that never ended. Appearances have been used to defraud the eyes of entire peoples. Religion has been used to tranquilize dissent, to decorate injustice with holy stories. There is no guarantee that sincerity survives contact with opportunity. That's why his second book matters. The Discourses is a long hymn to limits. That's why your small republics, your teams, your friend circles, your families need rituals to keep the powerful human. Invite dissent. Rotate roles. Make power interruptible. Leaders should ask questions they do not know the answer to. They should engineer moments where they are small in a room that does not punish smallness. Think of Machiavelli in his cottage, scribbling, then exhausted, then calling up the dead again, like a priest who prefers ghosts to neighbors. In one letter, he dreams that he meets a crowd of ragged souls at the gates of the afterlife emperors, philosophers, generals, and he prefers their conversation to the small talk of the saved. He fantasized about advising the men of consequence he admired. He also brewed wine and gambled, and joked, and missed his old salary. The apostle of realism was also a man who wanted to be wanted. There is something achingly decent about that, if we allow it to exist. And the weight, we return to the weight. Parents holding boundaries, while their child rages something that sounds like hatred. Doctors rationing treatment when supplies run thin, deciding who will have a chance and who will be burdened with the word later. Editors choosing which truths to print and which to let age a little more in the dark, because timing is sometimes the difference between illumination and fire. These are not the moves of princes, but they share the same dirty hands. You will know you have used cruelty well, if ever, by what happens afterwards, whether the story of the cruelty gets smaller or becomes a new weather. If your necessary pain becomes a habit, you have become the nightmare that Machiavelli wrote to warn against, and God help us to teach. We could leave power here as a tragedy, but the world insists on hope, even if hope has to be armored. The psychology of power reveals not only our weakness, but our beautiful stubbornness. People organize. They recall each other's worth. They build little structures of care. They vote against their temper sometimes. They apologize before it's strategic. They quit jobs before the money finishes resizing their soul. They whisper that a shared law might be higher than a single man's permission. And sometimes, more often than cynics admit, a leader resists the animal inside that wants to never stop biting. There is a mercy in knowledge. Once you understand fear's grammar, you can hear when it's being spoken to like a lullaby with teeth. Once you understand appearances, you can ask for evidence. Once you understand fortune, you can stop confusing luck with love. Once you understand the paradox of power, you can forgive yourself for wanting influence, and then build fences around the part of you that only respects attention. This is psychology not as diagnosis, but as the art of seeing. Machiavelli, the exile, wrote to give you eyes that do not close as easily as they used to. Think of a crowd at twilight, gathered in a square, the light gold and low. A leader steps onto a balcony. The crowd hushes. The leader says the word together. The leader says the word destiny. The leader says the word safe. You can feel the tug inside your chest, a relief at the thought that someone else is driving, that the map is printed, that the weather has been bribed. Machiavelli would put a hand on your shoulder and ask, gently and without romance, "Do you know what you just gave away?" We are susceptible to theater because theater is efficient. Our brains are tired. Our days are crowded. We accept appearances because verifying is slow. We obey because disobeying costs social capital that feels like oxygen in a world that punishes soft lungs. Understanding this is not an invitation to smugness. It is an invitation to discipline. Before you give your assent to a person who promises to carry the weight of your fear for you, ask the old questions. Who benefits? Who pays? What happens to those who cannot clap? How does this leader respond to silence? How often do they invite correction? What would they lose if they were wrong? Machiavelli's lesson is not that goodness is foolish. It is that goodness without strategy becomes an alibi for naivete. And naivete in power is not an honest mistake, but a kind of neglect. You would not hand your child to a driver who has never seen a road in a storm. Why would you hand your hope to a person who cannot name their own temptations? If you lead at any scale, name them. Name your love of applause. Name your tendency to delay decisions until the harm gets quiet and therefore invisible. Name your belief that you are a special case. Invite someone into your office or your kitchen whose face does not change when you put on your mask. If you cannot find this person, build an institution that does it for you. The discourses whisper another defense. Decentralized dignity. Spread the power to say no. Write down the rules in a way that outlives charisma. Reward those who keep records, who count, who ask for receipts, not because they distrust you, but because they love the law that makes strangers less dangerous. Praise rituals that correct you. Teach children the difference between performance and responsibility. Build rooms where outsiders can sit without being converted into ornaments. Make it possible to fire the powerful before they teach the organization to love dependence. There is a quieter application for those who will never stand on balconies. Your life has small kingdoms. In them, you can practice a better Machiavellianism. Be the fox who sees the trap in your own thinking. Be the lion who pays the price of protecting those who cannot repay. Use your appearances to make virtue easier for others. Be reliable. Be clear. Be kind in a way that doesn't demand applause. Understand fear so that you do not manipulate it in people you love. And understand it well enough that when someone tries to manipulate yours, you feel the tug and keep walking. Fortune will not stop flooding. You can prepare. Save money. Learn names. Keep records. Forgive faster than your pride likes, and never faster than truth allows. Take one risk every season that teaches you something about your blind spots. For the day you need to be sudden, rehearse how to end a bad policy. For the day you need to be patient, rehearse how to absorb insults without making the world smaller because you are tired. Machiavelli is practical like this, if you read him with a hand that is not already pointing. He died without returning to the office he loved. He died with his city playing its old games and its new ones. He died with his name attached to an adjective that reduces him to a curse. It is an excellent joke the world played on a man who tried to reduce illusion. But his pages remain, and in them the refusal to pretend that human nature lives on the highest shelf. He insists that we tell ourselves the truth about the creature we are, and then build a home that keeps that creature interesting instead of monstrous. If you feel disenchanted, let it be a useful disenchantment. If you feel that leaders are actors, let that be the beginning of your script, not the end of your hope. If you feel that fear has been rented to you at a price you can no longer pay, give it back and ask for facts. If you lead, accept that you will stain your hands and that one day you will be judged by people who do not remember your reasons. Lead anyway, but write down those reasons and keep the stain from spreading into a fashion. The last question Machiavelli would want you to hold is personal and impolite. Who rules you? The part of you that wants to be comfortable, to be praised, to find someone to tell you where to stand, or the part of you that can listen to unwelcome news and then change. The psychology of power is not only about presidents and princes. It is about the choices you make at the edge of your own will. It is about whether you will be an armed prophet for your better nature, armed with skills, not weapons habits, not slogans. The old exile is still at his table. He opens the door to the dead and speaks to them. He speaks to us. He says the truth is not nice. He says the truth is not safe. He says the truth is useful. If this opened your eyes, subscribe to Boring History, because the truth is never boring.